Hello YouTube, we're back. So today I want to work a little bit on our snake game here. Um, what we're going to do today is a bit of refactoring, and I'm going to introduce working with our own modules rather than, so we've worked with modules so far by importing these other modules that other people have written. But I want to take some of our code and move it into other files that we can then import from rather than having it all in one big game file. And this makes it a little easier for us to logically separate out our code and make it so that the main game file is more about controlling Pygame directly and less about things like the classes that we're using and the color dictionary and the directions enum and all of that. So we're going to break some stuff out here. The first file we're going to need to create is our game config file. And in this one, what we're going to try and move into is controlling a few things from it that we can configure, like our colors. I'm going to go ahead and make colors as a dictionary all caps because it's kind of a, we're not modifying it. It's going to be something that we're just kind of reading from. So here, I'm going to take colors out because we moved it to that config file. And after config, we're going to import, after Pygame, we're going to import that config. So import, we're going to do a from config, and we're going to import colors. And what we'll do, we take this colors, and we're going to do a find and replace. So anywhere where we're using colors in down below, we're going to replace it with all caps. And we're just going to make sure that we do one at a time. I don't want to do them all because then we might replace something we didn't intend to. Oops, I've got this backwards. Put the colors, and we replace it with all caps. There we go. Bounce through, just making sure. There we go. Okay. So now all of the colors should be uppercase through here, and that is fine. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and do a new controls file, controls.py, and I'm going to take the enums here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this, and I'm going to put it right here for just a second so that we can take our import for enum. So we're only using this for one enum, so we might as well take the import and move it as well. So we're only calling it there. And what that means for us here is from controls import directions. Now, these two changes are very minor, but the reason why I'm putting config and controls in two separate locations is that we're going to expand on these files in the future and add things to them. So I feel like controls is going to be an area where we're going to put more enums that might have to do with controlling the movement of things or controlling the positioning of things, whereas the config is about things that we would use for controlling like the window and um, how fast things go and what sizes things are. So we're going to add some stuff in here as well for as we increase and decrease difficulty and things like that. So the next item is that we would typically break out is going to be classes. Now, because of the way we wrote the window class, we can't really break this one out because it relies heavily on Pygame. And if we move the Pygame module to being exercised in a class location, then we're not going to be able to reference it in the same ways. So this is a little bit of a mess that we're going to have to clean up during refactoring. And I'm going to save that for a later date. The easy ones to move are going to be snake and food. But in order to do the snake and the food, we're going to need to add some configuration options into the config file. So we're going to do config. We're going to go back to the way we used to do X, and that's going to be here, and Y, and then we're going to do size. And for now, we're just going to do 10 because that's what we've been using. But we're going to go ahead and start with food. We're going to take this, cut it, and we're going to do a new class, and it's going to be for food.py. Like we're going to do it in a file here. A lot of programming languages, you'll find a lot of classes are usually separated into their own files unless they're like inherited classes or other, because typically with classes you'll have parameters, properties, and you have properties and methods, which are like functions for the class, and so they can usually take up a lot of space on their own. So you'll typically break them out. So here we need to import random because we're using random rand range, and then we also need to from config import colors. Now we just added stuff to config, so we're also going to bring in this config under config. So it's config. Um, and what we're going to do under food is modify this to not require the display. And the way we'll do that is by using config x and config y. And instead of block size, it is config size. And since that's going to be the same in both locations, we're just going to move this. And now when we initialize food, it doesn't have to call to anything except for this config data. So we're standardizing and making a importable config dictionary that we can call anywhere that should be used for everywhere. So as long as if it's a configuration option that we may need to reference in different points, we know where to go get it because it's in config under config. Next up, we're going to do the same to snake. Now, if you'll notice, snake also uses an x and y location divided by 2 in order to find the center of the screen when we initialize the snake. It also uses the block size for the movement. So we're going to cut this. We're going to make a new file. And it's going to be snake.py. If you used snake.py for the primary file for your environment, I would recommend changing to Snake Game or changing it to, changing this main file to like game or main, or you can change the class files to be like snake class. That's fine. But over here, we clearly need to make a few changes. Number one, from controls, we're going to import directions, and from config, we need to import colors and config. We can pare this down to just self because we're going to use config x, and since it'll be easy, I'm just going to use copy and paste here, and we'll change this to config y. And then down here, we will take this block size out and we'll drop in size. So these changes are pretty straightforward. We're just going back a step on how we do our configuration for controlling X and Y sizing and all that. We can eventually set this so that it reads config information from the window, but for the moment, this will do what I want it to do. So we've taken these out, but now here we have snake trying to call here. We don't need to pass it these parameters. We don't need to pass it that parameter. And we're just going to pop through here and make sure that we're not calling anything weird. And the last thing we need to do is import up here. Now, we don't need to import random because random is only used when we generate the food. So we'll put that out of the way. Now, from config, I'm also going to import config up here because we're going to need that later. But we're just going to import from snake, we import snake. The reason we're doing this is because it's bringing it into the namespace in the same way that it's already being used. So we don't have to modify anything else because we already have it below. So those should be the big changes. Let's go ahead and test real quick. I have a refactor branch that I put in, but that's fine. Uh-oh, snake move. It takes one positional argument, but two we're given. So we still have something below that goes move. We don't need this. So now, there we go. And as you can see, it still works. We've just moved everything around. Uh, so you have to make sure that you go back through the functions that we were calling because we're no longer passing value to the functions to or methods to update. We're now pulling it directly from the configuration, which should, in theory, save us some overhead because we're pulling from the same source over and over and over rather than passing data into the methods and using a little more memory each time. We're just pulling from one source and holding on to that information as if it were a global variable. So that should do it for today. We are going to continue to break things down into additional files in the next few videos. So we're going to refactor all of this so that we can have it broken out. And then we're going to introduce difficulties. So we'll have like an easy, medium, and hard leveling. And we'll introduce a multiple food system and eventually introduce a potential for bad food to spawn. And as we get to that, it's going to be harder and harder to play. We will also go through and try and clean up some of the potential for the food to spawn on the body and things like that. So I hope you all stay tuned. This has been a long run, and I am hoping that we can push through and get to more of a finalized product. At the end of all of this, we're going to introduce another utility that will actually compile this into an executable so it's not just raw source code, and you'll be able to work with that as well. If you'd like to see the direction that this tutorial is headed in, there is another repository on my GitHub that has more of a completed and finished product. If you want to go see what we're headed towards, um, we'll kind of get into a little more explanations on the different pieces as we go. But for now, I'm trying to branch us out into multiple files and multiple file usage so that we can see how larger projects will turn into like a big multi-file structure and how you can keep things organized. And then we'll probably come back through and after everything's done, said and done, we'll do a refactor that will start introducing conventions. If we don't do convention refactoring on this, then we'll probably start being a little more strict about how we do our naming conventions in future tutorials. Because I'd like to start working on that myself personally. So it's one of the things I want to share is like how do we find common ground in our naming conventions. So that'll do it for me today. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll catch you in the next one.